Hey everyone! Just a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button if you're enjoying my stories. It really helps me know you're into the content. Thanks for tuning in, and let's dive right in. I pulled into the parking lot, the cold glow of the fluorescent lights spilling over the cracked asphalt. The hospital loomed before me, its windows darkened except for a few faint glimmers where the night staff worked tirelessly inside. Welcome to my new beginning, I thought, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. After 10 years as a nurse, I had seen it all: burnout, impossible hours, and a constant revolving door of patients. But this time, I had a contract I couldn't refuse: shorter shifts, better pay, and a chance to step out of my comfort zone. Still, there was a nervous flutter in my chest as I stepped out of the car and approached the main entrance. It wasn't just the unfamiliar surroundings. Something about the air itself felt heavy, as though the building was holding its breath. Shaking off the unease, I straightened my shoulders and pushed open the door. Inside, the nurses' station was a flurry of activity. People in scrubs hustled by with clipboards and coffee cups, their movements brisk but their faces strangely detached. The woman behind the desk spotted me immediately and offered a warm, if slightly strained, smile. "You must be Chloe," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Rachel. Welcome to the night shift team." "Thank you. I'm excited to get started," I replied, trying to match her enthusiasm. Rachel led me to the staff room, where a few other nurses were gathered, chatting quietly. They greeted me warmly enough, introducing themselves as Susan, Darren, and Emily. But I couldn't shake the feeling that their smiles were a little too wide, their laughter a little too forced. They asked me the usual questions about my experience, why I transferred, and whether I was ready for the challenges of night shifts in a psychiatric hospital. "It's not like your average hospital," Darren said, leaning back in his chair. "You'll see some unusual cases here." I nodded politely, chalking up their odd behavior to the exhaustion that comes with night work. After a few more pleasantries, Rachel showed me where to store my bag and handed me a laminated map of the hospital. "Why don't you do a quick round before your break?" she suggested. "Get a feel for the place." I walked the quiet halls, my sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished linoleum. The dim lighting cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with every step. As I moved from room to room, I glanced at the patient charts. Most of the names were unfamiliar, as expected, and the patients themselves were either asleep or mumbling incoherently. A few stared blankly at the walls, their eyes unfocused. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Psychiatric patients often had a tenuous grip on reality, especially at night. Still, the silence felt oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. Then I noticed the signs. Several doors were marked with bright red posters that read in bold, capital letters, "Do not enter without supervision." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stood in front of one of the marked doors, listening. Nothing. No sound from inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I turned to Rachel when I circled back to the nurse's station. "What's the deal with the signs?" I asked. She looked up from her charting, her expression unreadable. "Oh, those rooms? They're for some of our special cases. Patients who might be dangerous if you're alone with them. It's nothing to worry about. Just make sure you're with someone if you have to go in." I nodded, filing the information away, but her tone left me unsettled. It wasn't what she said, it was how quickly she brushed it off, like she didn't want to talk about it. As the hours ticked by, the oddness of the hospital became harder to ignore. The low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed louder in the quiet, and the air seemed colder in certain hallways. Every so often, I caught patients staring at me through their door windows, their gazes glassy and hollow. By the time my first break rolled around, I told myself it was just my imagination. Adjusting to a new hospital was always nerve-wracking, especially at night. But as I headed to the staff room for a much-needed coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. And not just the patients. It wasn't paranoia. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite name. The break room was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint clink of utensils against plates. I sat at the small table, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee and trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had followed me throughout my rounds. The other nurses were seated together, chatting softly, their words barely registering over the pounding in my ears. I tried to focus on my coffee, but I couldn't help noticing their glances. Quick, fleeting, as if they were trying not to make it obvious. I chalked it up to first-day nerves. They're just curious about the new girl, I told myself, even though their attention felt heavier than that. Chloe, you okay? Rachel's voice cut through my thoughts. She sat down across from me, her smile kind but just a little too tight. Yeah, just getting used to the place, I replied, forcing a small laugh. She nodded. It takes time. This hospital's unique. She paused, studying me like she wanted to say more. Before she could, a faint noise from the hallway caught my attention, a shuffle followed by a soft thud. I'll be right back, I said, rising from my seat. The hall was dim and silent, the only sound my footsteps echoing off the linoleum. I was almost at the nurse's station when I felt it, a hand grabbing my arm, pulling me sharply to the side. Before I could react, I was yanked into one of the restricted rooms, the door slamming shut behind me. The patient was a woman, her thin frame trembling as she clung to me. Her wide, bloodshot eyes darted around the room, as if she expected something, or someone, to burst in at any moment. Run, she whispered, her voice cracking. You have to run before it's too late. They're going to keep you here. Don't let them. Hey! What are you doing? The door burst open and Rachel stormed in, grabbing the woman and pulling her back with surprising strength. The patient thrashed and screamed, her nails raking the air as Rachel forced her into the corner. 2 orderlies appeared moments later and together they restrained her, strapping her into the bed. I stood frozen, my heart racing as the woman's screams turned into sobs. Run, she whimpered one last time before Rachel closed the door. What the hell was that? I managed to say, my voice shaky. Rachel let out a long sigh, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Don't worry about her. She gets like this at night, more anxious, more paranoid. It's common in patients like her. Patients like her? I repeated. Severe delusions, hallucinations. You'll get used to it, she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her grip was firm, reassuring, but it didn't stop the pit forming in my stomach. Come on, let's get back to the break room. I followed her down the hall, my thoughts racing. The woman's words echoed in my mind. Run before it's too late. Was it just the rambling of a disturbed mind, or did she know something I didn't? Back in the break room, the tension from before seemed even thicker. The nurses' chatter died as soon as we entered, and their eyes flicked to me, then away, like they'd been talking about me. I sat down and picked at the sandwich I'd brought, my appetite long gone. Rachel sat beside me again, her tone light and conversational, as if nothing unusual had just happened. So, how are you finding things so far? It can be a lot to take in. It's different, I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded knowingly. Night shifts are always a little strange, especially in a psych ward. Patients get restless, their symptoms can escalate. But don't worry, we've got your back. Her words were kind, but her smile lingered just a second too long, making my skin crawl. Why don't I give you a tour, she offered, rising from her seat. It'll help you get your bearings. I hesitated, but eventually nodded. A tour might distract me from the growing unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. Rachel led me through the hospital, pointing out different wings and explaining the layout. She was friendly, almost overly so, her voice full of practiced cheer as she described the various wards. But as we passed another door with a red sign, I couldn't help but glance at it longer than I should have. Those rooms aren't anything to worry about, Rachel said, catching my gaze. Just stick to the rules and you'll be fine. She smiled again, but this time it didn't feel reassuring. Rachel left me at the nurse's station with a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You'll be fine, she said, her tone light, but there was an edge to her words I couldn't place. If you need help, just holler. I'm here all night. I nodded and tried to focus on the charts in front of me, even though my nerves were frayed. The tour had been thorough. Almost too thorough. Rachel had walked me through every wing, pointing out patient rooms, the supply closets, and even the break room I'd already visited. But what stuck with me was the door to one of the restricted rooms. I had seen the name etched on the brass plaque beside the door, Emily J. Hayes. At the time, it hadn't meant anything to me, just another name in a sea of unfamiliar ones. But now, back at the station, the name nagged at the edges of my mind. With a deep breath, I logged into the hospital's system to start updating patient records. It was straightforward: medication logs, observations, standard notes for the night shift. My fingers moved automatically over the keyboard as I tried to push the earlier events out of my mind. But then I saw it. The name appeared again: Emily J. Hayes. Only this time, it wasn't listed under the patient roster. It was listed under staff records. My breath caught as I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking at me like it was mocking my confusion. Emily J. Hayes, registered nurse, night shift. I double-checked the file, hoping it was some kind of clerical error. It wasn't. The profile was complete, with her hire date, certifications, and even a photo. Her face was familiar. Not from earlier tonight, but from the employee ID hanging on the wall in the break room. She was one of them. But why was her name on the door of a restricted room? The air in the station felt suddenly oppressive, like the walls were closing in around me. I rose from the chair, my pulse hammering in my ears, and started toward the restricted wing. I didn't know what I was looking for. Answers, maybe. But before I could take more than a few steps, I froze. Every patient in the hallway was staring at me. Through the narrow windows of their doors, dozens of eyes bore into me, unblinking and lifeless. Some faces were slack, others twisted into faint, eerie smiles. It wasn't the kind of gaze that begged for help. It was the kind that stripped you down to your bones. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The patients didn't move. They just stared, their heads tilting slightly in unison, as though they were following some silent cue. I turned and ran. The break room was the only place that felt even remotely safe. My hands were shaking as I pushed the door open, desperate for the familiar hum of conversation, even if it came with the unnerving tension that had hung in the air earlier. But the room was silent. Rachel was there, standing by the small table, and my stomach sank when I saw what she was holding. My backpack. She didn't even flinch when I walked in, her fingers methodically rifling through the contents like she had every right to. My wallet, my phone, even my small notebook. They were all laid out neatly on the table, like evidence in an investigation. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Rachel looked up, her expression calm and almost pitying. "You shouldn't have seen that name," she said simply. I took a step back, instinct telling me to run, but before I could reach the door, the other nurses appeared. Susan, Darren, and Emily. Not the Emily on the door, but the Emily I'd been introduced to earlier, blocked the exit, their faces devoid of the warmth they'd shown before. My heart was a drumbeat of panic as they closed in on me. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the small room. Rachel didn't answer. She simply smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill down my spine. The others lunged at me before I could react. I fought back, kicking and flailing, but there were too many of them. Someone grabbed my arms, another my legs, and I felt the sharp sting of a fist colliding with the side of my head. The world tilted, and then everything went black. I woke up to the metallic taste of fear in my mouth. My eyelids were heavy, and my limbs felt impossibly heavy, like they weren't mine. As I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, the sterile scent of antiseptic stung my nose. I tried to move, but thick leather straps dug into my wrists and ankles, holding me firmly to the bed. Panic surged through me, pulling me further out of the fog that clung to my thoughts. My mind was sluggish, like it was wading through molasses, and it took a moment to register where I was. One of the restricted rooms. And standing at the foot of my bed was Rachel. Her smile was nothing like the one she'd given me during my first round of the hospital. It was wide and unhinged, her teeth gleaming like a predator about to pounce. She tilted her head, watching me with a cruel glint in her eyes. "Good morning, Chloe," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "You're finally awake." What's happening?" My words slurred, and I struggled to focus. My head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, my thoughts scattered and distant. "You've been admitted," Rachel said simply, as though that explained everything. I tugged at the restraints, panic rising like bile in my throat. "Admitted? What are you talking about? I'm not a patient, I'm a nurse." Her laugh was sharp and mocking. "You were a nurse. But now you're one of us." I froze, my mind racing. The patients. The stairs. The woman who had warned me to run. It all clicked together with sickening clarity. Rachel leaned closer, her grin widening. This hospital has unique needs, she explained, her tone casual, like we were having a friendly conversation over coffee. We're understaffed, underfunded, barely holding on, but we figured out a system, a way to keep things running smoothly. What system? I demanded, though my voice was barely above a whisper. Her eyes gleamed. Sometimes the best patients are the ones who don't even realize they're sick. People like you. Smart, capable, full of promise. It's not personal, Chloe. It's just necessary. You're insane, I spat, my voice trembling. Rachel chuckled, patting my arm like I was a child throwing a tantrum. Insanity is just a matter of perspective. You'll learn that soon enough. She straightened, smoothing her uniform, as though she hadn't just shattered my entire reality. You'll be well taken care of here, I promise. But you should get some rest. You'll need your strength for group therapy later. I opened my mouth to protest, to scream, but she turned and walked out of the room before I could get a word out. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, and I was left alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the crushing weight of my situation. The days blurred together in a haze of drugs and confusion. Nurses I had worked beside now treated me like a patient, their tones patronizing and clinical as they handed me medication or adjusted my restraints. The drugs dulled my mind and made time feel elastic, stretching and compressing until I couldn't tell how long I'd been there. But one day, something broke through the fog. I was escorted to the activity room, my wrists bound in soft restraints. The room was filled with other patients, some drawing, others sitting silently, their gazes vacant. And there, across the room, was the woman who had tried to warn me. Our eyes met, and a flicker of recognition passed between us. Her expression was guarded, but there was something else there, too. Determination. I sat down at a nearby table, trying not to draw attention as I watched her. She glanced toward the door, where a nurse was stationed with a clipboard, then slid a piece of paper toward me. My heart raced as I picked it up, pretending to examine the crude drawing on the front. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "We're getting out. 3 days. Be ready." I looked up at her, my eyes wide. She gave a barely perceptible nod before turning her attention back to the paper in front of her. Before I could process what was happening, an alarm blared in the hallway. The nurse by the door sprang into action, leaving the room to deal with whatever emergency had arisen. The woman leaned closer to me, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you want out?" "Yes," I breathed, my voice trembling. "Then stay quiet and follow my lead," she said, her tone firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We only get one shot at this." The alarm stopped, and the nurse returned, her expression calm, as though nothing had happened. The moment of opportunity had passed, but hope had taken root in its place. As I was led back to my room, the weight of despair lifted just slightly. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could escape. The next few days crawled by in agonizing increments, but for the first time, I felt a sliver of control over my circumstances. The woman from the activity room, her name was Mara, as I learned during one of our whispered conversations, was the key to everything. She'd been here longer than anyone else in our group and seemed to know the routines, the weaknesses in the system, and, most importantly, the staff's blind spots. Mara and I communicated in fleeting moments, during group therapy, in the cafeteria, and even in the brief seconds when our paths crossed in the hallways. Every word had to be chosen carefully, every glance deliberate but subtle. The nurses were always watching, and one wrong move could unravel everything. "We need a way to distract Rachel," Mara whispered one day during therapy, her lips barely moving as she pretended to scribble on a piece of paper. "She's the most alert during rounds. If we don't deal with her, we're done before we even start." I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure how much of this plan would actually work, but Mara's confidence was infectious. I started faking compliance, taking my medication without a fuss, but subtly tucking the pills under my tongue until I could spit them out later. Without the fog of the drugs, I felt sharper, more aware of my surroundings. The other patients involved in the plan, Mara had carefully vetted them, worked quietly behind the scenes. One of them, a wiry man named Victor, had somehow swiped a paperclip during his daily chores. Another, a soft-spoken woman named Lila, managed to pocket a keycard from a careless nurse. We were small but resourceful, each playing a role in the unfolding plan. Mara's leadership kept us focused, her instructions precise and methodical. "I'll create the distraction," she said during one of our secret exchanges. "Rachel is territorial. If someone challenges her authority, she'll zero in on them." "And the rest of us?" I asked. "You'll get the door sensor disabled. Lila and Victor will handle the keycard. Once the door is open, we run. No second-guessing, no looking back." On the night before the escape, tension hummed through the air like a live wire. I barely slept, my thoughts consumed by the details of our plan. What if we missed something? What if Rachel or one of the other nurses caught on? But there was no turning back now. When the final night arrived, we were ready. I felt like a tightly wound spring as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and waiting for the clock to tick toward the critical hour. My palms were sweaty, my heart racing, but I forced myself to focus. The sound of footsteps in the hallway signaled the beginning of rounds. Rachel's voice drifted through the door, calm and professional as she checked on each patient. Mara's distraction came like clockwork. "Rachel, I need help." Mara's voice rang out, loud enough to echo down the corridor. I could hear the irritation in Rachel's tone as she responded. "What now, Mara?" The commotion grew louder as Mara escalated, her voice rising in desperation. The sound of a tray clattering to the floor punctuated her outburst, and I knew Rachel wouldn't be leaving her side anytime soon. The final night. This was it. I slipped out of bed and crept toward the door, careful not to make a sound. Victor was already in position, his hands steady as he worked the paperclip into the panel of the door sensor. Lila stood nearby, clutching the stolen keycard like it was her lifeline. "Hurry," I whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. The paperclip slipped, and Victor cursed under his breath, but he didn't stop. Finally, there was a faint click, and the panel popped open. He yanked out a wire, and the tiny red light on the door sensor blinked off. "Got it," he said, his voice tight with relief. Lila swiped the keycard, and the lock disengaged with a soft beep. We moved as one, slipping through the door and into the dimly lit hallway beyond. My heart pounded in my ears as we crept toward the exit, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant sound of Rachel's angry voice. But we weren't safe yet. As we rounded a corner, a nurse appeared at the far end of the hall. For a moment, we all froze, the shock of being caught paralyzing us. Then Mara acted. She lunged at the nurse, catching her off guard and knocking her clipboard to the floor. "Go," she shouted over her shoulder. We didn't need to be told twice. Victor and Lila sprinted ahead, and I followed, my legs trembling with adrenaline. The exit was just ahead, the cool night air visible through the glass doors. I didn't look back as I ran. The moment my feet hit the asphalt outside the hospital, the cold night air was like a slap to the face, sharp and undeniable. For a second, I felt paralyzed by the sheer enormity of what we'd just done. But there was no time to stop and think. The blaring alarms shattered the stillness of the night, their piercing wail chasing us into the darkness. "This way," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the chaos as I gestured toward the narrow service road that ran behind the hospital. Mara stayed close behind me, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, while Victor and Lila darted ahead, their shadows stretching long in the dim glow of the hospital's floodlights. Somewhere in the distance, the shouts of the nurses echoed, growing louder with each passing second. "Keep going," Mara urged, gripping my arm briefly before pushing me forward. The service road twisted and turned, each corner feeling like a gamble. I wasn't even sure where I was leading us, only that we needed to keep moving. The sound of footsteps behind us grew fainter, but the alarms continued to wail, their oppressive rhythm driving us forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled onto a desolate street. A single flickering street lamp cast an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. We paused, gasping for air, our lungs burning from the sprint. "We can't stop," Victor said, his voice hoarse. "They'll send someone after us." But I could tell he was as spent as the rest of us. Lila leaned against a utility pole, clutching her side, while Mara scanned the street, her sharp eyes searching for anything or anyone that might help. Then I saw it. A payphone. I sprinted toward the payphone, fumbling in my pockets for change that wasn't there. Victor shoved a coin into my hand, his expression urgent. My fingers trembled as I dialed 911, the numbers blurring together through my haze of adrenaline. 911. What's your emergency? We need help, I stammered. We've escaped from St. Alban's Hospital. Something horrible is happening there. They're keeping people against their will, drugging them, abusing them. Please, you have to send someone. The operator's calm, steady voice guided me through the details, and soon, she assured me that help was on the way. I hung up, my hand still shaking as I turned back to the others. They're coming, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We huddled together under the street lamp, waiting in tense silence. Every distant sound, a car engine, the rustle of leaves, made my heart leap into my throat. But finally, flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance, accompanied by the reassuring wail of police sirens. The police acted quickly once they arrived, questioning us briefly before storming the hospital. Watching them disappear into the building that had been our prison was both terrifying and cathartic. For a moment, I worried they wouldn't believe us, that they'd dismiss our story as the ramblings of unstable minds. But then one of the officers returned, his face grim. You weren't exaggerating, he said, his tone heavy. Over the next few hours, the hospital's secrets unraveled. Patients were found sedated and restrained without cause, records falsified to justify their confinement. Evidence of abuse, neglect, and illegal admissions was uncovered, implicating the staff in a horrifying scheme to maintain the hospital's funding and fill its beds, by any means necessary. The nurses who had tormented us were arrested one by one, their forced composure crumbling under the weight of the evidence. When I saw Rachel being led out in handcuffs, her face twisted in rage, I felt a surge of vindication. The following days were a whirlwind of police interviews, depositions, and news reports. I gave my testimony, reliving every harrowing moment in excruciating detail. It was painful, but I knew it was necessary. The other patients who had escaped with me were transferred to more reputable facilities where they could finally receive the care they deserved. Mara and I exchanged a quiet goodbye, our bond unspoken but unbreakable. As for me, I couldn't bring myself to return to nursing, not yet. The thought of stepping into another hospital made my chest tighten with anxiety. But I couldn't walk away entirely, either. Instead, I started volunteering with advocacy groups, fighting for reform in psychiatric care. What happened to me, what happened to all of us, should never have been allowed. And I vowed to do everything in my power to make sure it never happened again. Even now, the memories haunt me. The sterile white walls, the cold metal restraints, the empty stares of the patients who had been there far longer than I had. But those memories are also my fuel. I survived, and I'll make sure that survival wasn't in vain.